Welcome to another episode of The Riffle, a podcast series brought to you by 10 Leaves. Today, we are opening up a really critical file from the Dubai International Financial Center, the DIFC. We're going to be doing a deep dive into the regulatory roadmap set by the Dubai Financial Services Authority, the DFSA.
That's right. Our mission today is to really dissect the final word on Consultation Paper 165, or CP165. And this wasn't just some, theoretical discussion. This was the DFSA taking a really hard look at the licensed functions and authorized individuals, the people who actually run the show in the DIFC.
And the source material we have is it's the definitive feedback statement dated December 2025. What makes this so interesting, so rich, is that it gives you a unique window into how regulators actually think. We get to see their internal calculus.
Exactly. I mean, we know the DFSA got 50 different sets of comments from authorized firms, compliance consultants, you name it.
So this document is essentially the DFSA explaining, almost line by line, which concerns they took on board, which they dismissed, and crucially, why the final rules look the way they do. Okay, so let's set up the core tension here. The DFSA, they came out swinging with a pretty massive proposed change. They wanted to hand over almost all the responsibility for suitability, that whole fit and proper test for key roles like compliance officers, finance officers. They wanted to hand it straight to the firms. So the big question for our deep dive today is, did the industry's pushback actually work? Did they force the DFSA to keep mandatory authorization, or are firms now completely on the hook for every key hire? So, starting with the big picture, what was the DFSA even trying to achieve with this overhaul? It seems like, the intention was good. It was all about modern accountability.
The foundational goals were pretty uncontroversial. Pretty much all 50 respondents supported them. The DFSA really wanted two main things. First, to emphasize that firms themselves bear full continuous accountability for making sure their staff are fit and proper. And second, they wanted to broaden the application of the conduct principles to cover more employees. It was about improving the whole culture.
Right, so everyone agrees on the high-level goals. But the moment they introduce the how, the mechanism to get there, that's when things got spicy.
That's where it became radical, because it targeted the regulatory relationship itself. The DFSA proposed removing the requirement for prior authorization for the compliance officer, the finance officer, and the senior manager. They were going to be reclassified as designated functions, and the people as designated individuals. The firm would still tell the DFSA, but the regulator wouldn't have to sign off first.
That sounds like tremendous regulatory relief, at least on the surface. I mean, if you're a CEO, you can hire faster, right? No more waiting for the DFSA's green light.
You'd think so.
So why didn't the whole industry just embrace that speed and freedom?
Well, that's the paradox. A few respondents, a minority, they did agree. They said it was pragmatic, proportionate. They felt the firm really is best placed to judge suitability day to day.
Yeah.
But that shift from authorized individual to designated individual carried a lot of weight.
Okay, let's pause right there. Why did that specific term, designated individual, cause so much anxiety? What's the actual risk in the DIFC when you move from authorized to designated?
It's mostly about credibility, both internal and external. See, an authorized individual has been personally vetted and approved by the regulator. That gives them a kind of regulatory armor.
Okay, I see.
If you strip that away, the concern was, well, twofold. Externally, it could lower the perceived status of the role in the global financial community. But internally, and this is maybe more important, that designation is an anchor for their salary, their authority. If your compliance officer is only designated by the CEO, they might have a lot less leverage when they have to challenge that same CEO on a risky business decision.
So it's less about the paperwork and much more about their standing within the firm. You're essentially taking away the formal regulatory backing that lets them push back into the business side when they need to.
Precisely. Yeah. And that's exactly why the majority of those 50 respondents came out so strongly against removing DFSA authorization for those three roles. They wanted that deterrent. And the opposition was very detailed. It clearly resonated with the DFSA because it tapped right into the functional integrity of the whole financial center.
So let's break down the three main arguments that ultimately kept the old structure in place. What were the specific concerns that made the regulator walk it back?
First, and this was probably the most critical point, the consensus was that DFSA approval serves as I'm quoting here, a critical deterrent. Just the knowledge that the regulator is the gatekeeper and can withdraw that approval, it keeps people on their toes. It compels them to maintain higher standards. Losing that was seen as a huge risk.
That makes perfect sense. Accountability has to have teeth. And you said the second point was about internal authority.
Yes, exactly. They were worried that reclassifying these critical jobs as just designated functions would weaken their perceived authority inside the firm. A compliance officer needs institutional respect to do their job, and a lot of that flows from being a mandated, regulator-approved function.
And the third point was about clarity, I think.
Correct. The respondents were afraid it would create confusion, a sort of delineation of roles problem. Who is formally responsible if something goes wrong? If the key people aren't explicitly authorized, it just risked muddying the waters.
So after hearing all of this, what was the final verdict from the DFSA on the compliance officer, finance officer, and senior manager?
The DFSA concluded not to proceed. They hit the brakes. All three remain classified functions. They still require prior DFSA authorization, and that whole designated function category, it's been shelved. The industry, you could say, successfully argued for keeping that core piece of the framework.
That's a pretty big win for stability. But if the DFSA is keeping the authorization, are they still achieving their original goal of making the firm more accountable? Or did they just give up on that?
Oh, they absolutely did not give up. And this is the crucial twist in the story. While they kept the authorization, the new rules aggressively reinforced that firms remain fully and continuously responsible, not just for the appointment, but for the ongoing fitness and propriety of their staff. The regulators basically saying, we'll still guard the gate, but you own the keys to the maintenance schedule.
Okay, let's pivot to the finance officer. The DFSA also suggested removing the mandate for that role, saying it wasn't really necessary for all firms, especially the smaller ones. Did the industry push back there too?
They did, and with overwhelming success. The feedback showed large support for keeping the finance officer as a mandatory appointment for all firms, regardless of their size. The feeling was that strong financial oversight is just too important to make optional.
I can see why. I mean, financial resource requirements are totally non-negotiable in a regulated space. Did the DFSA clarify the role's duties at all when they decided to keep it?
They did. They refined the definition to be very explicit. The finance officer's responsibility now specifically references compliance with the financial resources requirements in what's called the IFR module.
And just to ground that for everyone listening, the IFR module is basically the DFSA's rule book on capital adequacy and liquidity, right?
Precisely. It's the book of rules that makes sure firms can actually pay their debts and stay afloat. So making the finance officer explicitly responsible for that compliance really underlines the seriousness of the role.
Now let's talk about the operational burden. If the DFSA keeps authorizing people but still wants to push accountability to the firm, where did that new burden actually land? I'm guessing it has to be on the ongoing assessment.
You hit the nail on the head. This is one of the most significant changes, operationally speaking, based on positive industry feedback. And yes, some firms actually welcome this clarity. The DFSA amended the rules, specifically GEN Rule 7.7.12. It now requires firms to check and confirm an authorized individual's fitness and propriety at least once a year.
Wow, so that annual review is new, and that is not a small task. If you're a compliance head, that means you're dedicating resources every single year to documenting, reviewing, and signing off on the F&P of every authorized person. That feels like it's shifting the DFSA's paperwork onto the firm's budget.
In a way, yes, but it ensures perpetual accountability. The DFSA's view is that fitness and propriety isn't a one-time thing. And individual circumstances can change their integrity, their competence. This annual check makes the firm continuously accountable for that.
And what about complex situations? The DIFC is known for people holding jobs across multiple firms. How did the DFSA tackle that capacity challenge?
They brought in a very clear mandate. It's under GNRO 7.5.1b. Firms now have to explicitly satisfy themselves that anyone performing a licensed function for more than one firm has enough time, capacity, and lacks conflicts of interest. The firm has to actively consider the nature, scale, and complexity of the business. It forces a real formal capacity check instead of just assuming the person can handle it all.
Let's get into the granular details of these roles now and the assessment process. First, that compliance officer definition. How is it clarified?
The DFSA clarified the CO's role to make sure they're responsible for, and this is key, overseeing the implementation and application of the firm's compliance arrangements. This wording was a deliberate move to separate the CO's role from, say, more prescriptive first-line management duties you might see in standards from the Basel Committee, the BCBS. The DNRO is strategic oversight.
And what about AML responsibility, anti-money laundering? Is that now strictly on the MLRO?
Absolutely not. GEN Rule 7.6.1 confirms that it's a shared senior management responsibility. The senior executive officer, the MLRO, and the compliance officer all have to show they have sufficient knowledge of AML requirements. The DFSA is really pushing that AML compliance is a culture, not just one person's job.
Okay, diving into the F&P assessment criteria.
Yeah.
This is where firms really needed some practical relief. You mentioned the first draft on financial soundness was seen as too hard to monitor. What was the worry there?
The old wording required firms to monitor if an individual is able to meet debts as they fall due. And firms, quite rightly, argued that this was super intrusive and frankly unworkable. Were they supposed to ask to see personal bank statements every year? It created a huge administrative and privacy problem.
So how did the DFSA adjust it to be more practical but still effective?
They changed the focus from forensic accounting to risk indication. The new criteria is about checking for material indications of a poor credit record or an inability to manage personal finances. It's a shift from being their personal banker to just checking for red flags that could pose a risk to the firm or the individual's integrity.
That's a huge, very pragmatic change. What about integrity checks? Especially around past misconduct, it's a fine line between due diligence and a witch hunt.
A very delicate balance. They address the concern that firms might over-rely on just rumors. The guidance now clarifies that firms shouldn't rely on gossip and rumors. Instead, they have to consider if allegations are serious, timely, and well-founded before using them in an assessment. It forces a level of fairness into the check.
And on the governance side of all this, did the DFSA give firms a standard form to use for this new annual review?
They explicitly decided not to. They rejected the idea of prescriptive frameworks or mandatory forms. They stuck with their proportionate approach, saying firms are best placed to figure out how to comply based on the nature, scale, and complexity of their business. A small firm can have simpler processes than a giant bank.
And finally, let's wrap this section up with the conduct principles, the CPs. Who's covered now, and what's this new disclosure requirement?
The scope is much, much wider. Conduct Principles 1 through 4 now apply to all relevant employees. And that's a broad term for anyone involved in the firm's financial services business, though it does exclude ancillary staff like, receptionists or maintenance. Principles 5 and 6, those stay reserved for the senior license functions, reflecting their higher duties.
And the specific new principle just for the authorized individuals?
It's a dedicated regulatory duty. The DFSA created a new Principle 7. It only applies to authorized individuals. It mandates that they disclose appropriately any information of which the DFSA would reasonably expect to be notified. And, crucially, they took that proactive disclosure requirement out of Principle 4 for everyone else. So it creates this clear, elevated duty for the most senior people to talk to the regulator.
What a process. This deep dive really shows a regulator that, well, actually engaged with the feedback it got. The takeaway seems pretty clear. The DFSA listened to the industry's demand to keep the deterrent power of formal authorization for the CO, the FO, and the senior manager.
Absolutely. They kept that traditional structure, but they used that decision to simultaneously impose stronger, more continuous accountability on the firms themselves. I mean, the mandatory annual F&P review and that explicit capacity check for multi-firm roles, those are major increases in governance. It's a real balancing act.
So for all the firms listening to this right now, what is the timeline for putting these pretty substantial changes into practice?
Okay, so the updated rules were published in December 2025. They've given everyone a 6-month transition period, so they officially come into force on 1 July 2026. Firms need to use that time wisely. They need to adapt their internal frameworks, update their F&P documents, and, critically, roll out training to all relevant employees on these new conduct principles. It's not just a manual update, it's a culture shift.
And so here's the provocative final thought we want to leave you with. Given that the DFSA has specifically said it will be focusing on firms' approaches to assessing fitness and propriety as a priority, and that they might hold firms accountable for weak practices in that annual review, how will this heightened supervisory focus change the day-to-day governance structures, and maybe more importantly, the size of the compliance team in the DIFC leading up to that July 2026 deadline? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.